Hello, welcome back guys, and in this video, not in this video but previous video, we designed book list, add book page, and then we were able to open those page as well, right? And finally we prepared the book object, which of course contains all the book data that we captured from add book page using input components, right? And we also created bookstore, and then we are also able to trigger those APIs. But since we did not created those API yet, so in this video we are going to create all those APIs which we need in our Vue.js application to show the data, the book data. So without wasting much time, let's get back into code, and this time I'm going to open server folder. So let me just close this client folder over here, and this time I'm going to open close server folder. And what I'm going to do is, since we need a couple of APIs, right, that is going to be related to book, right? For that, what I'm going to do is, very first thing I'll create a service for book. All right. So here I'll say book service dot go, and then we know that very first thing what we need to do inside Golang file is of course package, and in this case service is going to be the package, right? And then what we are going to say, okay, and we need this service to be abstracted, right? This implementation should be abstracted. So what I'll do here is I'll say I interface book service. So this interface will contain all those required method declaration or definition, or you can say the method signature. All right, and then we are going to implement those method signature on a struct, right? And we can say that that is going to be book service struct, right? We'll see that in action. Okay, so here I'll say interface, and then this will contain couple of methods. Actually that is nothing but Crud operations: create, read, update, and delete. So very first what I'm going to say is create book, right? And what I will be doing here is I'll just go back in user service, I'll just copy it, right? And then I'll go back in book service, I'm going to paste it here, but this is going to be create book, right? So rest of the thing will be same as it is, since data is going to be of type any, but we'll restrict our data to be of certain struct. And how we are going to do that, we all know that, right? So let me go back. Very first thing what we need to do is, if we are going to design any new model, new collection, right? For that what we need is, we need a file of the specific domain, not domain but of a specific data. So this time we are going to play with book, right? And the book details should have saved in a MongoDB, correct? So for that, what we need to do is, we just need to define a model first, so that based on those models we should be able to save the data in the collection, MongoDB collection. And if you are going to use, of course, different database, for example SQL, so in that case you are going to use entity, just the name difference, but the concept remains same. All right, so here I'm going to say book.go, right? First thing first, I'm going to say package is going to be model, and then this time type is going to be book, but it is going to be struct, not interface, right? Because we need a structured data of book. So okay, that's fine. Then what else we need? We need couple of properties that is going to be related to this book. So I'll just copy it here and paste it here. So ID will be there, of course, and then book name will be there. So instead of name, I'm going to say book name. And here, so the name which I'm going to define here in bson or JSON, bson means the same key is going to be saved in the collection, and then JSON will be when we are binding those data back to our struct, so it will get binded using this JSON key property. All right, so then we can say, okay, the data which is coming from UI is in the format of underscore, right? Underscore and small casing. That's what we were following in the previous video, right? So I assumed book name will be coming like this, right? And then this will get binded with the book name. That's cool, right? So what are all fields we have? I hope we have book name, and then we have book code as well. So I'll say book code, and what else we have? Okay, we have book name, book code, we have description as well. So I'll say description, and here also I'm going to say description, and this all data are required, so I'm not going to put omit empty. What we need to do is we just need to put a comma, and then if we'll say omit empty, that means this field is not required. If that field is empty, you can of course omit that field, right? So this all data is required, I'm not going to do that, but description we can omit. If we don't want to put description over there, you don't want to put description, you can of course omit that description. It is completely optional. So I'm going to put omit empty, and here also I'm going to say omit empty. Cool. So we have book name, book code, description. What else we have? So let's go back in client and we'll see what we have prepared over there. But I can go back in here also, and I'll say, let's see that here why we need to open the client folder and then see those data one by one. Instead of, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy it and then I'll paste it here, so that I can create all those fields here, and finally I will delete this. Since this information we don't need here, we just need the key, right? So just to write that easily, I copy pasted here. And then we have author as well, so I'll say author, and it's going to be of type string. Then so I'll just simply copy this and paste this over here. So author is of course going to be of type string, and then here I'll say author, here also I'll say author, right? So book name, book code, author, description we have. Then we will be having book price as well. So I can say price, and then not small p but capital P, so that this field will be accessible. We all know that why we are going to make variable with Pascal casing, right? Because if we are going to make it with small casing, that is of course camel casing or any other casing, that means this variable is going to be private. This variable is no more accessible outside of this specific package. Cool. So we just need this variable to be exposed outside so that we can access that variable. So here I'm going to say, okay, this is not going to be of type string, so I'm going to say float 32, let's say, right? And here, so again this float 32 and float 64 is of a data type. And what is the difference between that? Float 32 will store a certain point of characters, not characters, you can say certain point of digit, right? But in float 64 we'll have more option, no, not more option, but we can store more digit than float 32. All right. So here I'll say price, and JSON is also going to be of name price. Cool. And then finally we need two more variable, and first one is going to be page count. So I'll say page count, and here also we need to rename it to page count, right? Now finally what I'll do is we need published year here, so I'll say published year, but this time this is going to be of type integer, right? This is not going to float 32. Page count is, integer value, right? So I'm going to say integer int, and then of course the price, not price, this time this is going to be published year, right? So published year is also going to be in integer, so I'll say integer, and then this is going to be published year, so I'll say published year. Cool. So far we are good, right? So now we don't need this actually. I'm going to remove this, and I'll just, okay, we need to import this primitive as well, because this is inside MongoDB package, so this must be imported here. As you can see, now we don't have any error. I'll just save it. Now finally we have a book model ready, and we know why we created this, right? Based on this only we are going to structure all those book data, and then the same we are going to save back in DB and we can also fetch those data using this book struct, right? But here I want to add couple of more things, okay? And what is that? So I'll say status, and this is going to be of type bool. What does that mean? Why we are going to put status over here? So what I'm trying to do is, let's say if we have one book and that book is no more available, or you can say that book we are no more going to store, right? But previously it was there. So what we can do, instead of deleting those books, we can say okay, status as false, which denotes those books are no more available, and we can see that in UI as well, okay? So it completely depends on you. If you want this functionality, you can of course use this, or else if you don't want, you can just omit this functionality, right? But if you guys are facing any issues, please let me know in the comment section, so that I can work with you basically, and I can make you understand easily, and we can make a good product overall. All right, so I'm going to say status, right? And then JSON is also going to be status, right? Cool. So what's next? Okay, first time user, if user is not going to give any status, we can say omit empty, but let it be for now. And then I'm going to say okay, which user is going to add this book. So we should have a user ID there as well, so that at later point of time, later if we want to know like which user added this book, if we'll talk in real time, we have a bookshop, and then in that bookshop there may be a number of staff which is working over there, right? But those staff will have access to addition of this book, right? Book data. But how we will know that which user, as a owner, how can I say which user have added this book? Let's say this book, we are not going to sell this book, but some of the staff intentionally or unintentionally added this book. But as a owner, I should be able to, I should be able to authorize that, right? So I should know whether that book, who has created that book basically, which user, right? So for that, I'm going to store user ID as well there in the book collection, right? So what I'm going to say is created by, which is of course who created this book data. So in this case, of course, I'm going to say primitive dot object ID, because this object ID is nothing but it is going to be user ID, okay? So that we can say okay, there's a reference between book and the user. And what is the reference? User is able to access or create this book, right? So in case of access, we don't need that, but yeah, in case of saving those book data, we need that. Why? Because later in the application, we should be able to know okay, which user have saved this book or created this book. So I'm going to say primitive dot object ID, and then the rest thing is going to same. So here what I'll just copy this and I'll paste it, but instead of underscore ID, this time it's going to be, let's say, created underscore by, right? So same, I'll copy here and I'll paste it here, but we need this data for sure. So I'm not going to make it optional. If there's no user ID, we are not going to save this data, right? So and then we also need one more thing which I'm going to put here, that is modified by. So who has modified those books? Let's say one of the staff created this book and then other staff modified this information of the book. So we should have those staff data as well, so that we can know okay, you did this, you did that, right? So it's not to blame anyone, but we should be able to track all those information. That's why we are saving this information, right? So here we can say okay, this time it is going to be modified by, right? Let me just type modified by, just a second, what I'll do here is modified by. Cool. So now we have this two information over here, but we need one more information there as well. Okay, and what information I need to say, okay, when this book data was created, right? Since that user created this book, but we should know when that book was created. So I'll say created date, right? And then this is going to be of data type time dot time, right? That means this should be of a specific timestamp, right? And here I'm going to say bison, and then of course this is going to be created date, and then JSON is also going to be the same, right? If you want it to be different variable naming, you can of course do that. You are free to play with this variable naming and all, so that you can get a better understanding of it, how it is working, and how JSON data is getting binded if it is coming from client, and how this bison data is getting binded to the struct. Cool. So here I'm seeing these issues. Why? Because we have two book name over there, right? So this time we are going to say book code, okay, because this variable is, this data is book code. Okay, so we are good with created date, and then we need modified data as well, right? We should be able to know when this book data is modified. So I'll say modified date, and then here also we need to say modified date. I hope you are getting all these concepts. Modified date, right? Let me just save it. We are almost done with the book data. Okay, so now we are going to, what we are going to do, okay, we have this book data ready, book model ready actually. So we are going back in our book service, right? But before that, we need to do one more thing over here. We are going to just copy this, right? And since we are not going to take ID and those fields, right? So we can just copy this and make a DTO of this as well. Okay, how I'm going to do that? I will say DTO. Okay, here we have the DTO folder, and then in that I'm going to create book dot, not book, but I'll name it book underscore DTO dot go. We should name that file and package or whatever as per our functionality, so that we should be able to, you know, understand it properly. We should be able to know by just seeing it what this functionality will be doing. Okay, first thing first, I'm going to do package, and then I'll say DTO, of course, in this case, and then I'll just copy paste here. In this case, what I'm going to say is, instead of ID, here I will be receiving string, because the data, even though this is primitive object ID of type MongoDB, right? Not MongoDB, but it's a object ID coming from the MongoDB. But in this case, when we are going to take data from the client, we won't be having that as a MongoDB. We'll be having the hex format of that, and hex format is nothing but the string format of that ID, right? So for that, I'm going to say string, and I'm going to keep it omit empty. Why? Because this data may or may not be there. For example, in case of update, this data will be there, but in case of creating new book records, this ID won't be there, right? So that's fine. So I can say here, or else what we can do here is we can say create book DTO. Okay, so we know that of course in create book DTO we won't be having this ID, so I will omit this ID from here, but then we need update as well. So in case of update, what I'll say is, here I'll say update. Cool. Update book DTO. In update book DTO, we need this ID anyhow. All right, cool. And then what data we want to update? Okay, we can update book name, we can update book code, description, we can update author as well. No, we cannot update the author. Why? Because once author write its books, right, no one can change that. So he's also he or she is going to be the author of the book, correct? So we won't allow editing author, so I'll remove this. And then price we should be able to allow. Why? Because let's say we are selling one book as of now for $2,000, and then later we want to sell that, we want to apply some discount on that book and we are going to sell at 1,500. So that's completely legal here, right? So published year is also we are not going to change. Okay, but if you want that to change, you are free to do that. I'm just showing you the example and how we are going to proceed. Okay, so page count also, let's say I'm not going to change, it will be of the same page. Okay, and then password. Why we need password over here? We don't need password actually. I'm going to remove this. So the password must be there in book model as well, so we don't need that. I'm going to remove that, right? And here the same thing I'm going to say. Okay, published year will be there. In this case, create, in case of create, we don't need this, so we can remove this fully. ID won't be there, book name and this all details will be there, but this details will be of type string, right? So created by and modified by will be of type string, and then created date, modified date will also be of going to be type time. Cool. But in this case we should not allow them to, let's say we should not allow them to modify, change the modified. Okay, modified date will be changed, but we should not allow them to change created date. So let me remove this, right? And then here what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to string. Why? Because from the client it will be coming as a string format, not the object ID format. Of course that is the object ID, but when data will come, it will also automatically convert into a string, and then again we have to convert those string back into the MongoDB object ID, right? So status, of course we should be able to modify, but then password we don't need. Cool. So we are going to update this much of data only, right? Book data. And if you want to update more data, you are free to do that. I would encourage you to do that so that you can understand it more better. Cool. So we have this DTO in place, and then we need one more DTO. Okay, I will create that later when we are going to use that. Okay, but for now we need these two. So what I'm going to say is not these two, but yeah, these two we need. So next what I'm going to say here is I'll go back to book service, and this is completely fine. Now we need couple of more signature over there, method signature of course, and in this case I'm going to say, let's say get all books, right? And then get all books will get all the book data, right? So I'm just going to use session context. I'm not going to filter those books based on certain condition. We can do that later, but for now let's make it Mongo session context, and here I'll say session context. Cool, right? And then here what I'm going to say is interface and then error, right? So get all books will be there, and then we will be having get book by ID as well. So I'll say get book by ID, right? So here I need those IDs, so I'll say ID, and that is going to be of a string, we'll be converting those string back to MongoDB object ID. Cool. And then we will be having functionality related to update. So I'll just copy this and I'll say update book by ID, right? In that we need, of course, we need interface, and then session context will also be there, and we will be returning this interface data once more back to the client. Cool. Now we need one more method. Using that we should be able to permanently delete this book. Let's say by mistake we created this book and we don't need this book anymore, so we'll just delete this. So I'll say delete book by ID, and then here we need again ID, so I'll say ID, and of course we need session context. Okay, this is completely optional. If you don't want to use session context, you can of course omit this variable completely. But why I'm keeping that, because if there's transaction involved, in MongoDB, so there we need to send the transaction object in each of the method, so that if any point of time, any failure point of time, all those data will get reverted back or rolled back, so we won't be having any inconsistent data in the DB, right? So here what I'm going to say is again mongo dot session context. Cool. And then this will also going to return interface and error. Cool. We have 5 methods over there, and we'll implement those methods quickly. So I'll say okay, now I'm going to define one book struct. So this will have actually repository. Okay, I've imported this repository, but I want to use repo alias. This is going to be the alias name by which this repository will get imported. Now we should not use repository, instead we are going to use repo. So here I'll say repo dot, I'll say Mongo repository, iMongo repository. We are not going to use the actual implementation of the Mongo repository, right? We are going to use just the iMongo, that is interface. That is how we are going to use this, right? So here I'll say okay, that's completely fine. Next, what you need to do is you need to implement all this method present on this interface, then only this struct will satisfy this interface. Okay, how we are going to do that? Of course, we are going to say func, and then we'll say book service. So I'll say book service, and then the method name one by one, so that we can implement all those methods on this specific struct, right? I'll just do copy, paste. We have 5 methods over there, and then we'll just copy the method signature one by one and paste it. This is the a smart way of doing work. I'm not saying I'm smart, but we need to do like this so that we can save our time and invest those time in development, in doing good works, right? So I think I'm talking much, but no issue, we are talking good. So here I'm just going to copy all those methods one by one and paste it here, so that we can say okay, all this method has been implemented by book service, and then this book service satisfies iBook service, so that we can achieve polymorphism, we can achieve abstraction, right? Okay, I'll copy this from here. Sorry, I'll just copy this and I'll paste it here, and then delete also I'm going to copy, and then finally I'll paste it here. So we have all those methods implemented on this specific struct. So now we can say this struct satisfied interface book service, right? So instead of this actual implementation, we are going to use iBook service, but we have those implementation in place. So we can say okay, get book service, and this time what we need is we'll go back to user service. Let's see what we did. So we need repository over there to to get the iUser service, right? So similar thing we are going to do here as well. So I'll say repository, and then I need repository of what? I need repository of Mongo repository. So I'll say repository.imongo repository, and this will be returning iBook service. Okay, so I'll return and address of this Mongo, not Mongo, it's going to be a book service, and then inside repository I'll say repository. Cool. Let me save it, and then we are going to implement all those methods here. So what I'll say is, let me do that one by one. So first I'll go back in user service, and what we did there we can see we just saved those data over here. So I'll just copy it from here, and then I'll come back here and paste it. This time this is not going to be US, since this is not user service, this is book service of course. Then repository, okay, we are not going to use Mongo repository directly. Instead we can say repository.repository, so that we will have access of all those repository which we are creating over here. Okay, so here instead of user repository I will say just use. Okay, but before that what I'm going to do is I'm going to register a book repository as well. How can I do that? Here I'll go and I'll say book repository, right? And this is also going to be of type iMongo repository, because it will implement all those CRUD operation here, so that we can use those method and perform the book operation on book service. Okay, so since we defined those here, and then database name, okay, so here also we need to say book repository, and I'll say book Mongo repository, get Mongo repository, and here we need the database name. So I'll pass DB name, and also in this case we need a collection name as we saw in case of user repository. So I'll say collection name is going to be, let's say, book. Cool, I'll save it and go back here. So then we'll be having access to book repository, right? This is just a concept of abstraction, so we are just going to use this specific iBook service, and then we will be calling this methods over there, right? So here just we'll say create. That's it. We don't need to do anything more here. Okay, and in this case of get all books, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, okay, you need all those books, right? So for that I'll say return book service dot repository dot book repository dot, and then we have find all method over there, right? This find all method needs a filter, right? But as of now we need all those books, so I'll say filter is empty. Cool, not empty, but we need to say, okay, it is going to be interface. Cool, is it cool? No, I don't think so. So I'm just going to assign empty interface over there. Let's see if that works. And next is what? Of course we need session context, so I'll say session context. Still it's giving error, this is not an expression. So what does it need actually is of type interface, filter interface. So if I'll pass nil, that is completely fine, but we need to make sure this functionality is not breaking because of this filter. So what I'll do here is I'll go back in find all functionality with that here, and I'll just open this. I'll see whether that filter can be nil or not. So I'll add one more condition over here so that we can omit the error. Okay, I'll say filter equals to nil, right? Since this is interface, so it can be of type nil. So in that case I'm going to say filter equals to, let's say, bison dot m. Okay, so this time if filter is not there, it will just use the default filter. Of course there's nothing going to be added in those filters, but yeah, this is how we can omit the error. We can make our function independent of any value, right? So that this function will be more testable and we won't be getting error. This function will be working in an expected way, right? So what's next? Okay, we'll go back in book service, and okay, this is how this is going to return the books. Cool. And then what else I'm going to say? We need book ID as well over there. So I'll say return bs dot, again the same thing, repository dot book repository dot find one, right? This time I'm going to search book by its ID, so we don't need find one by key. We'll say find one. Even that find one by key will also work. I'll just pass underscore ID or as key and then the value, right? But I'm going to use find one because we don't need to convert those things over here, that object ID. And then we need session context. Cool. Now next thing what I'm going to use here is update book by ID. Cool. So how we are going to update the data? In this case, we'll be accepting the map data, and then we will convert those map into the interface, or let's say we'll just omit those interface. Okay. So for now what I'm going to say is, let's say result, right? And I'll say error. Cool. And here what I'm going to say is, then again I will be calling the repository method, and this time the book repository as well. And then I'll say, okay, you just do update. Cool. Now you need ID as well as the data. So I'll say, okay, you need ID. So what I'll do is I will take out the ID here. Okay, how I can do that? First thing first, I'm going to typecast this interface into map of string interface. Why? Because I'm going to accept the data from the client in format of map. Okay, so I'm going to say, okay, accept map of, just convert this into map of string and then interface. Okay, now we will be having, not this data, actually I will be saying book data. Okay, book data. Now we have typecast that into book data, and finally we should be having ID there as well. So how we can say that? So I'll say book data dot, not dot, I can say ID, right? But this book data ID again should be of type string. Cool. Now we can pass this ID here and then the book data, right? Not like this, book data. But you can see we have error over there. Why? Because not book data, actually we need to send the data itself, but still we are having error over there. Why? It is expecting ID. Okay, it is expecting one more data, so we can say book data will also work, and then we need session context, right? So now this book data will have all those data that is coming from client, but after taking out ID, what we are going to say is just delete this ID from the book data. So for that I'm going to use delete function. It will accept those data as the first parameter, actual data, and then the key. So using this key, this delete function will delete the data from the book data. So I'm going to say, okay, you need to delete underscore ID. Here also it will be underscore ID. Now finally, apart from ID, we'll be having all those book data. So why? Because we are not going to update underscore ID. What if, let's say, ID is changed, someone intentionally changed the ID? In that case, a new ID will get created over there, which is of course not a good thing, not a correct thing, right? So this is fine now, and then instead of response error, I'll just say return it. Cool. So let me save it. We have implemented update book by ID, and then here what I'm going to say is delete book by ID as well, right? So how we are going to do that? We are going to say, okay, let me use bs dot repository dot book repository, and then I'll say delete. Cool. So delete, I'll be needing those IDs. So ID we have, and then session context of course we have. So we don't need anything here, we'll just return it. That's completely fine. And then why we are getting this error here? Because we are accepting repo.imongo repository. So instead of that, we need to put repository. Let me save it, and we are done with the service. We should be able to call this all this interface method, and then it should be working in the expected way. Let's see that in action. Okay. So now we have service ready. What we are going to do is we need to make a controller for this as well. So quickly what I'll do is I'll just create book controller. Book controller, if you guys feels any issues or any problems you are facing, let me know in the comment section so that we can resolve that as soon as possible. And you just need to go through each line of code and understand it properly how it is working. This is very easy actually. So I'll say book controller, and then in this case, of course, very first thing first, what we need to do here is package, and we'll say controller, right? I'm going to define a type book controller. I'm not going to make it interface. Why? Because we don't need interface over here. We already talked about that. Why we don't need that. If you want to revise that, you can go back to that videos, and then again you can see that videos. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to just register all those function over here. For that, what I'll be saying here is, okay, but this book controller will need book service. So I'll say book service, and in this case, of course, book service should be there. For that, we need service package. So I'll say service dot book service, right? Now I'm going to register all those methods on this book controller. So I'll say BC, and then BC is nothing but short form of book controller. I'll say book controller, right? So I'll say create, but this time this function is going to be no more pure function, or you can say no more generic function. This is going to be of type gin function, not the type gin function, but this is going to be of course handler function, which should be able to handle the request which is coming from client, right? So here I'll say context. So this method signature should have gin.context. We should have access to context of gin. Okay. Now this method is of course not going to be of returning type. So I'll just say fine, right? So we need 5 method over there. One is for create, and then I'll say get all, right? Get all books, I'll say, to be more specific, and then I'll say get books, not like this. I'll say get book by ID, right? And then I'll say update book by ID, and finally I'll say delete book by ID. Cool. Now here what I'm going to say is, since those data will be coming in a request JSON, request body, I'm going to say, okay, let's go back to auth controller, and we'll just copy this functionality. Cool. So that we don't have to write it once more. We all know that, we all have written that, and we know that how we are going to write this piece of code. So, but if you don't know, of course, I would recommend you to write it from scratch, so that you can learn it as soon as possible. And if you know that, then of course you can copy. So I'll go back in book controller, and here I'll just copy paste this, but this time we don't need login DTO. This time we need create book DTO. Cool. And then this login book DTO should be changed to, let's say, book DTO. All right. And what else we have? Right. Then controller name is going to be changed. This time it is going to be book controller. So let's make it book controller, and FMT we need to import, of course. So finally we have book data accepted from the parameter, right? Next what I'm going to do is we need to send this data to the service, right? so that we can save that properly. So I'll say response, and then we'll be having error as well if there's any error, right? So here I'm going to say, okay, BC, since BC is having access to book service, so I'll say book service dot create book. As simple as that, right? And here we just need to pass book data, and then the session context in this case is of course going to be nil. So if there's any error, I'll say if error not equals to nil, in that case what I'm going to return is, this time this will be returning, okay, error. Let me go back here, and we can see we are just passing those error to the gin function, right? So I'll just copy this line of code, or we can say just copy this and paste this over here. So I'll just copy and paste, and this time not AC but BC, that is book controller, but we need response service as well. So I'll say response service, right, response service, and this is coming from utils dot response service, I believe. Response, is that fine? Yeah, response service. Great. Is that so? Yeah, that is it actually. So here I'm not going to say response, so I'll say data. It will be coming back as a data. Not data, you can name it as per you want, okay, but in here I'm going to say it as a data. Fine. So I'll say successfully saved. Actually this should also be inside a constant file. You can make it in a constant file. Let me save it. Okay, now the same thing is going to happen in update as well, right? But this time in update we'll be using update DTO, update book DTO. All right, so rest of the thing will be same, but okay, one more thing here. This function is no login function. This function is actually create. So instead of create, I'm going to write a book. That will be more specific, so that we should be able to debug it. We should be able to find it easily, right? I'm saying this more and more because you will be able to remind it properly. Okay, so create book, and then in case of update, it's going to be update book by ID. So what I'll say is update book by ID, right? And then instead of create book, I'll say update book by ID, right? So the data and then all those things we have already in place. So this is fine actually. Now in case of get all books, we don't need any data in the body as of now, because I'm not going to use any filter. If I'm going to use any filter later in the tutorial, I will be adding those filters. But if you guys want to add filter over here, you're free to do that, and of course I would recommend you to do that and test it how it is working, right? Now what I'm going to say here is, I will say okay, I don't need that all. So what I need, I'll say, let me paste, I'm sorry, I'll just copy it from here to here, and I will paste that here. Instead of update, I'll say get all books, and then we just need context in this case. So yeah, that's cool, right? I'll save it, and then we are going to do same thing in get book by ID as well, but this time get book by ID is going to be get request, right? So I will say okay, var book ID, and the book ID will be coming in params, right? So I'll say, of course you can accept this in query, you can accept this in body as well, but I'm going to use this for simplicity in params. Tick. So here I'll say okay, ctx dot get params. We have one functional, not params, right? We have one functionality in gin context. So here we just need to pass the variable name which is coming from which is coming inside request params. Okay, so I'll say book ID in this case. Cool. So actually what is happening here, it invalid option cannot call non-function. So let me just do this. No, so I'll say get param. Okay, get param will accept the key. So now here I'm going to say, let me just control Z, right? Instead of params, I'll say ctx.param. So it will find book. It will look into params, request params with the key book ID. Okay, if it is there, we'll get that book ID, and then we need to check if book ID is nil, or you can say if book ID is not there. In that case, what we need to do is we need to send bad request. So here we are not going to use any should bind JSON because the data is not there in the body. So I'll say if not book ID, right? Not like this. I'll say if book ID equals to empty. Cool. In that case, okay, this is going to be a type string. So of course in Golang we need to compare string with the empty string. By default, string will initialize as empty string. Okay, we cannot compare it with nil. So I am comparing it with empty string here, and then instead of here error, what I'm going to say is book ID is not present in, let's say, request params, and this error is for ourselves only. We see that how we formatted this error and how we intercepted this error and then again send back to the client, right? If you want to see that lecture, you can go back and see that lecture as well, how we did that. So now we are good with validation, and then finally I'll say response, not response, I can say data. I'll just copy it from here, okay, and then I'll paste it here. But this time not get all books, this time I'll say get books by ID. But we need ID here and then session context. Of course session context is going to be nil in this case because we are not using any transaction, right? So in this case I'll say book ID, that's completely legal, right? Here we should not say successfully saved, actually we should say fetched successfully, right? We should say fetched successfully, fetched successfully, right? In this case successfully saved is fine, but in case of here also we are going to say fetched successfully, right? So that is why we are following a certain pattern, so that you can see I am just able to copy and paste it, right? It's as easy as that. So fetched successfully, and then update book by ID. Here we should say what should we say here? We can say updated successfully, right? But one more thing I want to say here, instead of 20 I'm going to return 201. In this case that means created as per naming convention of the status code, HTTP status code. You can see all those status code, you can search it online and you will be having all those status code, and what that status code is doing, you can read about that. And if you have any doubt and you feel any issues, you can just let me know in the comment section. I will clear all of your doubts as early as possible, right? So enough talking. Here also I'm going to say 201, you can use whatever you want here, but make sure that if it is successful you should send all those status code which relates to success. Okay, so get by ID also is done, and then finally we need what we need. We need to delete that as well. So delete is of course going to be similar functionality, and here also we'll be sending book ID in params. And then first thing we need to change the name here, so I'll say update. Update book by ID is there, but here get book by ID should be there, right? So I'll say get book by ID. Why? Because we need to, if there's any error, we should be able to log this error properly, and we should be able to find out those exact method from where it is breaking, right? So get all books. Here we don't have any error actually, because we are not accepting any issues, not accepting any data from the client. But of course in the coming session we are going to accept certain filters, so that we should be able to filter those books based on certain criteria or certain conditions, right? Here what I'm going to say is delete, okay, book ID will be having, but we should change the logging string here, okay? So here that is fine, and then in this case I'm going to say delete book by ID, and then book ID and nil, fine. And in this case I'm going to say deleted successfully, save it. Finally we are done with the controller, no rocket science, it's as easy as that. And why it is very easy? Because we have created a structured way, we are following a certain design pattern in our application, and on top of that we are able to integrate, we are able to create as many as model, as many as data you want, or as many as functionality which you want. This is the beauty nature of, you know, following a certain design pattern. So I'll say get book controller, right? And in this case I need the same service and the response service, so I'll just copy it from here, I'll paste it over here, right? And then this will be returning user controller, and then I'm going to return of course the address of user, not user controller actually, I need book controller, right? You need to be very careful, book controller, and then this book controller need user service, so that is already coming from the params, right? And then response service, so that is also coming from the params. But what error we are getting here is user service, not user service, actually we need book service, right? So I'll say book service, even I'm confused here, not confused but I did wrong. But if I'm doing wrong, you guys can ping me and let me know I'm doing wrong, right? Since you guys are expert now creating these APIs, right? Okay, we are good with the controller, we have created service, we have created model, we have created controller as well. Now finally we need to say, okay, controller is ready. You need to map this controller, this handler, to certain routes, so that when request is coming on the specific route, this controller function or handler function should be able to handle those requests. Simple, right? So for that we need to go back in routes. We all know that we should map those handler and path, route path here in the routes, right? So this time I'm going to say, okay, create one more route file with the name book underscore routes dot go, and very first thing first, package is going to be routes. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just copy this so that I can follow the same structure. I'll just copy it, I'll go back in book routes and I will paste it. That's the beauty of following design pattern, again I am saying, right? But this time it's not going to use a route, so I'll say it as a register book route, right? And then we need repository, right? User service, using repository only we are going to access user service, and then using user service we are going to get, not user service, actually we need book service over here, so I'll say book service. I'm still stuck on user, right? Because user is doing all those works, so that's why. But let's use book service, fine. So we have access to response service, we have access to repository, and then user service. Now we can say, okay, we don't need controller anymore, we are going to use book controller this time, okay? So the functionality is also going to be changed, so this time book controller, and here I'm going to say, okay, use book service instead of user service, and then of course response service should be there. Now this add, or we can say just create book, okay? You can name it whatever you want. This time I'm going to keep it as a create. So finally we will be having method create book here, you can see. So we should be able to create this book. What I'll do is I'll just copy, paste, 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 paste. So one is for create, and next one is of course for, let's say I'll say get all books, right? Get all books. So this will fetch all books from the database which we have saved, and then we have get books by ID as well. So in that case, how we defined, right? Not get all books, we'll just keep it as empty, right? But here we just need to define by ID. So I'm going to say, okay, in the params, book ID will be there, but this time this request is going to be of type get. You need to make sure one thing over here, none of the request should get matched or should get duplicate. Okay, so that what will happen is, if you want to trigger a certain API, right, it may be a possibility instead of those the duplicate one will get called, and the different handler will be handling those routes, right? So you need to be very careful while defining the route so that exact path matches and the request and your request reach on the that specific path, right? So here get book ID, that's completely fine, and then here I'm going to say, okay, it's going to be update functionality. So I'll say in this case also I need book ID and then update. That's what we define in our client, right? So this is how we are going to follow the structure of API naming convention. So update is there, then we should have delete as well. So I'll say book ID and then delete. Cool. That's cool, right? So we have this all functionality over there, but then I need to map those function here, handler function or controller function. I'll say book controller dot get all books. I'll say book controller dot get book by ID. I'll say book controller dot update book by ID. I'll say book controller dot delete book by ID. That's it. We are done with mapping the routes to a specific handler or the function, right? I'll just save it and I'll register this, use this register book routes where in the main route file, right? This is how we are defining our routes, registering our routes. So I'll say book routes. You can say how beautiful it is. We have created a structure in certain way, and then we are just adding all those new functionality, and we just need to copy paste the things, right? This will save your time. So I'll say router dot group, right? This time the routes, base routes for the book is going to be /books, and then here I'm going to say, okay, register book routes, right? And I will be passing this book routes here. I'll save it. I'm done with the API, right? Now let me go back to client, and we should be able to trigger at least create API, and the rest of the API will be seeing all those APIs, we'll be testing all those API or integrating all those APIs in action in the next upcoming video. But for now, let me just go back to client, and since we have created those APIs, so I'll just go back to client here, and let me first check if everything is working fine, right? Server and client is working. So I'll go back here, I'll just say once more save. Not save, we have not entered any of the item here. So, but before that I'll do just refresh of the page. So if there's any issue, it will goes away. And then console also we don't have any issues. And here what I'm going to say is, okay, I'll say the Chronicles of Narnia, and the code is NAR, let's say NAR, not NAR, okay. And then the price I'm going to set $2,000 or any currency you want, and then page is, let's say 678, total page count. Author is, I'm going to author of this book, even though I'm not the author of this book, but for now I'm going to say author of this book. And then I'll put the published year. So I'll say, let's say 2025, and finally book description is optional, completely optional, right? So we can omit this as well as we can enter a few details over here. So this book is, let's say this book will get published in 2025 January, let's say, right? And then you can feed all those description here if you want, right? I'm just making it for now. So finally I'm going to click save, and then this should trigger the save API, and we should be able to see data in the MongoDB. How can we do that? Of course we need MongoDB Compass running in our system, so that this is the UI of the MongoDB, MongoDB database, so that we can able to access all those, not access, but also we can able to view all those data which is getting saved here, right? So instead of this, if you want to use the client terminal to connect with the MongoDB, and you want to see those data in the terminal as well, you can do that. Of course that is also possible, but to visualize the data properly we are using this UI. And then we can see here, I'll just refresh the collection. For that you just need to click this three dot icon, right? Click it and you have option to refresh database. Now you can see we have this much of database. So I'll open this bookshop. Since we are using this bookshop, we have only two collection over there. Even we don't need test, so we can remove this test from here, okay? And then we have only user over there. But when we'll save this book data, we should have a collection created over here with the name book, and it should have the respective book data. So let's see that in action. I'll go back to UI and I'll click save. You can see we are getting response back as 201. That means this book has been saved successfully, and if I'll click on that, I should able to see some data back. Yeah, we are getting those data back, and what we are getting over here is inserted ID, right? That's the ID, MongoDB object ID, which is which is applied on this specific payload, and finally this payload is saved in database. How we can identify that? Let's go back in database and I'll do refresh once more. You can see we have the book collection created over there. That's what the exact expectation which I already said to you, right? So if you will click on this book, you should be able to see all those data over there. You can see that's data, right? So status you will have false, right? Because actually this should not be false. Default it should be true. So we need to trigger this, we need to convert this data and make a status as a true, okay? So for now I'm just going to edit it from here. I'll just make it true, but later we'll change that, okay? Or let it be true for now, because if you are adding new book, so by default it won't go as soon as you add the book, it won't be visible to all, okay? So you just need to make it true, so that you are very sure that okay, this book should be published on my website or on my application, right? But at last we are able to see all those here. But here we can see, even though we sent price as 2000, okay, it's book price, but here it is saved as price 0. Why? Because if we'll go back in our book model, and there we can see we have defined only price. Actually this should be a book price. So what I'll do here is I'll just rename it to book price, right? And then it should be working fine. So instead of price I'll say book price, right? So finally what I can do here is, in the DTO I need to change that data as well. So I'll just copy this here, okay, and I'll go back in book DTO and I can copy this line and paste it, right? Here also we have price, so I'll just copy and paste that. I'll save this. Let this application restart, go application, and then we should be able to save those data. So here as of now what I'm going to do is I can delete this data so that we can save a fresh data, okay? So now the data is deleted. I can refresh this. You can see there's no data, and let's see if that server, okay, server is restarted. Today my system is working very fast, so that it is, restarting as early as possible. So I'll go back here and I'll say save again. You can see we are getting the response back, right? And I'll go back to DB and I'll just say refresh. Now you can see we have all those data, but still it is saving price. Actually this should be book price. How is even this possible, right? So let's go back in code. Here we are sending book price, and then in the code we have book price over there, book price. Create DTO also we have book price, fine. And then model also we have book price over here. So this data should be saved in the format of book price. So we need to just debug this, why this is happening, and that we'll see in the upcoming section. That is it for this video, guys. We are able to create all those APIs in which is there in place, and then we have integrated one create API in our client application, which is working fine. But then there's some error with the data, which we'll rectify over the period of time. And if you guys feel any problem, if you guys feel any issue, face any issues, please let me know in the comment section. I would try to resolve that as early as possible, and I should be able to make you understand this concept easily. And we all know that how this design pattern works and how this structure is actually benefiting us in a long way, right?